Fogheads, let's reinvent government. Let's recognize each other's right to exist. And while we're at it, let's remake reality and do away with death and taxes and get enlightened. And to top it off, let's get real. And this is Scoop Nisker with another edition of The Weekly Scoop. This week, the Clinton administration revealed its plans to reinvent government. The main idea seems to be the elimination of hundreds of thousands of government jobs. That should save enough money so that the government can start up a jobs program. If they really wanted to reinvent American government, Clinton and Gore should have announced that we were changing over to a parliamentary system. That might have reinvigorated American politics, but the Clinton administration just reinvented the wheel again, and the state rolls on, a little lighter maybe, and with a lot fewer jobs. Meanwhile, President Clinton and Vice President Gore have come to look at Sunnyvale, California as the model American city. Will they now try to turn the rest of America into Sunnyvales? Not that Sunnyvale's a terrible town, but maybe Clinton and Gore should have come to North Beach to look around as well. It's not a real efficient place, but life is not just about efficiency. There must also be funk and some low-tech retro life. Meanwhile, the Pentagon is reinventing the American military based on a 5-year plan that will create a new mobile high-tech force capable of fighting 2 wars at the same time. It's the win-win strategy. Of course, if you can win-win, you can also lose-lose. The Pentagon wants to put more money into microcomputers and stealth technology to build what they are calling brilliant weapon systems. Brilliant. Do these brilliant weapon systems make smart bombs obsolete? I define a smart bomb as one that refuses to explode. Maybe a brilliant weapon system would just spray laughing gas on the enemy. Speaking of military spending, I keep asking why the United States has to spend $290 billion next year on defense. Now I know. An article in the New York Times this week explains that 1/3 of that money, $95 billion, is still being used to fight the Cold War, which, you remember, ended a couple of years ago. The Pentagon still spends $40 billion to maintain our strategic nuclear arsenal, although it has absolutely no practical or even aesthetic value. And the Pentagon still spends $30 billion a year on so-called intelligence activities against the communists. If we're going to reinvent government, we've got to start by dismantling all 5 sides of the Pentagon, or else just turn the building into a big job retraining center for laid-off military and government personnel. A new government study released this week finds that almost half of American adults lack basic skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic. I think we can blame television for making us stupid. After all, we blame television for the violence in our society, and there's even more stupidity on television than there is violence. But maybe we are simply becoming the first post-literate society on Earth as America leads the way again. Soon all information will be exchanged through computerized images on TV screens, and we will all be living in Sunnyvales. Finally, Fogheads, there's real good news this week. The Israelis and the PLO have agreed to recognize each other's existence. And just maybe, that breakthrough in the Holy Land cradle of Western civilization will give birth to a new principle of peace across the planet, and soon China will recognize Tibet's right to exist, and Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland will recognize each other's right to exist, and the Hindus and Muslims in India, and the Tamils and Buddhists in Sri Lanka, and the blacks and whites in South Africa, and the indigenous and Hispanics in Guatemala, and the Christian fundamentalists and gays in America, and new immigrants and old immigrants in America, and humans everywhere will recognize all other species' right to exist, and we will all recognize each other as part of one life force spinning around on one planet, and we will all recognize each other. And for the Weekly Scoop, this is Scoop Nisker saying, hey, I know you. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, we've got the last days of vacation, fall anticipation, end of summer bummer, and Labor Day weekend news on another edition of the Weekly Scoop. The summer of '93 started with big news from the Middle West, the biblical-sized floods, and ends with big news from the Middle East, the biblical-prized battleground. The Israelis and Palestinians are finally going to recognize each other's existence after killing each other for years. All this time they must have been shooting at phantoms. Right. Biblical phantoms, fighting holy wars over who owns the Holy Land, and raising the battle cry of the ages, "Nya, nya, my God's better than your God." But both Allah and Jehovah were born in the same desert. They must be brothers. If the new treaty is signed, Yasser Arafat and the PLO will make their headquarters in the town of Jericho. Let's sing, Yasser fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. It was smart of the Israelis to sign a peace treaty with Yasser Arafat, who's looking like a moderate these days. Now the Israelis can just sit back and watch Muslim extremists try to kill him. Meanwhile, as one holy war was winding down this week, the Parliament of World Religions met in Chicago, the 100th anniversary of their first meeting in 1893. That's when the Indian Swami Vivekananda first brought the great Hindu Vedanta transformation message to the West and blew open a few minds. Historian Arnold Toynbee said that the Eastern wisdom coming to the West would be the most important event of the 20th century, and today there are hundreds of Hindu and Buddhist centers across the Western world. Tens of thousands of Americans and Europeans have taken on weird-sounding names and learned how to sit cross-legged on the floor. Next week, the San Francisco Zen Center and Spirit Rock Meditation Center will hold a conference for over 100 Westerners who are now teachers of Buddhism. They've got a tough job shrinking overblown American individualism before it's too late. It's hard teaching egolessness here in the land of personalized license plates. Meanwhile, back at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, the high priestess of the Covenant of the Goddess got permission for her Wicca worshippers to dance under the full moon in a Chicago city park. Many new gods and goddesses are immigrating to America these days, and border patrols won't keep them out. As a nation, we are in recovery from monotheism. And praised be to all the 10,000 names of the one, Hari everything, Hari Hari. And by the way, the Dalai Lama attended the Parliament. He says his religion is kindness. I'll bow down to that. And now we go from the cosmic to the mundane and the business of Labor Day weekend, which is labor. We start with a report this week that the U.S. Customs Service seized over 4 million pounds of Vietnamese coffee. There's a U.S. economic embargo against Vietnam, so it's illegal to buy their beans. Our government doesn't want American workers drinking communist coffee because then they might wake up and try to take some power and wealth away from their capitalist bosses. About all the American worker can expect these days from their bosses is Labor Day. This holiday is the only bonus you'll get from a corporate board that's downsizing, which means squeezing workers into smaller cubicles or moving their livelihood to a cheaper labor market and dumping them all together. If you want to know the condition of labor in America today, just watch the stock market go up right along with the unemployment figures. And maybe we should start having an un-Labor Day, fogheads. It would be one day in the year that the unemployed get to go to work. Anyway, one good thing to be said for the loss of jobs in California is that a lot of people are finally moving away. Happy trails, folks. Go ahead and resettle in Nevada and Oregon and Idaho. Let's even out the human bulges on the planet, as long as I don't have to go. Yes, this weekend I will celebrate the fact that I do my labor in this most glorious region of the world. Be thankful, fogheads, as you prepare your California cuisine picnics with gourmet blackened hot dogs on walnut sourdough buns. And if you have to stay in the city, come on over to Bump City, Oakland for the Heritage Festival's 3 days of jazz and salsa and blues and African dance. And whatever you end up doing, take this 3-day weekend to rest from the labor of your mind and the worry of your heart, dry the sweat off your brow and the grease from your elbow, and remember, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but Labor Day. And this is Scoop Nisker saying, as always, if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads! An article in the New York Times science section this week reports that the placebo effect is twice as powerful as previously believed, so just consider this the placebo news, which will make you feel informed and maybe even enlightened a little, but only if you truly believe that this broadcast is real medicine against the bliss of ignorance. And this is Scoop Nisker in the dog days and fog days of summer with a sugar pill of the weekly scoop. So what is happening? Nothing is happening, says a Buddhist friend of mine, and in August he's right on many levels. How can there be any news when we live in a space-time continuum where everything happens simultaneously? And how can there be any news when President Bill and the Congress of the United States are all on vacation, leaving us with nothing to diss or do except rehash the Clinton budget and try to anticipate what Hillary's September healthcare proposal will propose? You can bet good money it will contain the words managed competition, because in the United States we compete for wealth, and since health is wealth, we will also compete for health till death do us part. Speaking of death, 3 cheers for Dr. Jack Kevorkian. He doesn't compete with death like the American medical industry. Dr. Jack honors Dr. Death. In political news this week, we hear the rantings of second and third generation immigrant Americans trying to stop immigration to America, led by Governor Find Me an Issue to Revive My Popularity Wilson. They want to put up a Great Wall of China right here in America, fogheads, one that will keep the Chinese out. But in China, the Great Wall of China can't keep out capitalism and other foreign barbaric ideas, and so it will come to pass that China will become America and America will become China, and in the end, of course, all the walls will come tumbling down. There is no news at all from Bosnia or from the Middle East this week. Peace talks are off, peace talks are on, ceasefire off, killing on, killing on, killing on. Mr. Jesse James Johnson Jr. in Jacksonville, Florida, had a gun and he shot and killed a man because the man said Johnson's baby was ugly. Now Jesse James Johnson Jr. will probably have to go to jail, and his baby, Jesse James Johnson Jr., will grow up without his daddy, who thought he was a beautiful baby. But the big story of the summer of '93 continues to come out of the Midwest, where old Iowa farm couples are now trying to salvage their knick-knack 50s living rooms all smelling of Mississippi sludge. The mighty river of Mark Twain this year marked double Twain, the water so deep it covered the churches, whose congregations have now moved to makeshift barns to hear their ministers speaking that old line about the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, and ain't it the truth? And in the summer of '93, you can wash your sins away in the Ganges or the Jordan or the Mississippi. This is certainly not the summer of love, fogheads, but the Catholics had their own little Woodstock last week anyway. I wondered, watching them clean up after the Pope's Youth Summit in Denver, whether there were any Catholic boys and girls who lost their virginity on that very night of the Pope's visit, and wouldn't that be a load of guilt to live with? Worth a billion Hail Marys, at least. And finally, in this week of August, the Dow Jones hit a new record high while the eternal Dow remained the same. A few species were probably lost to extinction. Scientists came out with a theory that life on Earth was seeded by passing comets. And of course, the great cosmic space-time golden eternity continued to expand toward ultimate emptiness through an empty August news month, which creeps on in its steady pace from day to day, inevitably toward the fall. And for the placebo news, which may have given you the illusion of knowing what's going on, this is Scoop Nisker reminding you to stay high, but keep your priorities straight. And if you don't like the news, relax and wait until September, and then go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, the following broadcast has not been approved by the FCC, the FBI, the FDA, or the FDIC, Boris Yeltsin, or Hillary Clinton, or even the UN Commission on the Truth. But it does meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act, although it doesn't necessarily agree with them. And this is Scoop Nisker with another edition of the Weekly Scoop, a Rush Limbaugh laxative. Harper's Magazine Index of Statistics reports this month that since 1986, American oil companies have bought drilling rights to 3/5 of the land area of Somalia. Now, this doesn't mean that George Bush was not concerned about starving people when he sent the U.S. military into Somalia. This is just a statistic, and all it says is that since 1986, American oil companies have bought drilling rights to 3/5 of the land area of Somalia, period. This week, the United Nations Commission on the Truth issued a report charging that the Salvadoran military and its death squads were responsible for most of the atrocities committed during the 12 years of civil war in that country, including the murder of 6 Jesuit priests. During those years, the Reagan and Bush administrations gave El Salvador over $6 billion to, quote, promote democracy. All the while, they were lying to the American people about the crimes being committed in democracy's name. In the light of the UN report, we should acknowledge the noble efforts of the Bay Area progressive community, and especially the group CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, for their heroic struggle to break through the apathy and mendacity of the Reagan years, to stop the killing and tell the truth. Venceremos. The unholy wars continued around the world, fogheads. This week, outside of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, the FBI played a recording of Tibetan Buddhist chanting. It was Om, Om on the range. The FBI explained that they were trying to annoy the Christian cult members. They also played Achy Breaky Heart, but even that didn't drive the Davidians out. Maybe they should have tried Black Sabbath. Meanwhile, I've been trying to find out if the Tibetan chant recording used by the FBI was the same one produced by Grateful Dead drummer Mickey Hart, who could then sue the FBI for unauthorized use. A lot of people think the FBI is annoying, even when they don't have their boomboxes turned up. Okay, fogheads, if you saw Boris Yeltsin himself out panhandling on the street, what would you do? You might feel sorry for him, but before you gave him money, you would probably make him promise not to spend it on booze. Still, I guess it's better he spends it on booze than on nuclear weapons. We spent a lot of money to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and now we have to spend more money to help them recover from the Cold War, or else we'll probably have to spend even more money to defeat them in another Cold War. As the old saying goes, you just can't win. Finally, get out your jester's hats and rubber noses, fogheads, because coming up next week is a very special Bay Area occasion, commonly known as April Fool's Day, which is observed in these parts as one of the most important of all spiritual holidays, a neo-pagan revel. Celebrations include Wavy Gravy's First Church of Fun, which will congregate this year on Wednesday night, March 31st at Thunder Bay at the foot of Addison Street in Berkeley. Those who attend will be given their own funny mantra, be allowed to shake hands with Cardinal Sin, and will also get this year's joke. Then at 12 noon on Thursday, April 1st, the annual St. Stupid's Day Parade will embark from Embarcadero Plaza and make its way through downtown San Francisco, honoring St. Stupid, the patron saint of parking meters and civilizations. Worshippers are encouraged to bring along an extra sock for the traditional Pacific Coast Sock Exchange. One year I remember the parade stopping in front of the Prudential Insurance Building where 200 fools, clowns, and revelers began chanting in unison, "We want insurance! We want insurance!" It was a memorable San Francisco moment. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you, fogheads, that foolishness will get you through times of no money better than money will get you through times of no foolishness. And be sure to tune in next week when the Weekly Scoop will look at death and taxes and how to tell the difference between the two. Until then, stay high, but keep your priorities straight. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, it's the month of April, and time once again for the resurrection of Jesus, baseball, and the tax man. Every April, taxes and budgets get higher, baseball salaries go up, and Jesus rises into heaven. It seems the only thing that doesn't rise in April is the matzahs for Passover. April is also the time to stop and smell the flowers and spend a little quality time with your Mother Nature. And for the Easter weekend, this is Scoop Nisker with a springtime edition of the Weekly Scoop, giving you the lowdown and far out. This week, the Clinton administration submitted a federal budget of $1.5 trillion for next year, a figure that is incomprehensible to most of us. In a speech once, President Ronald Reagan said that if you stacked up 1 trillion single-dollar bills, it would reach miles into the sky. And of course, it was Ronald Reagan who also made the number a reality by putting the country over $1 trillion in debt. Back when I was a kid, the most of anything you ever heard about was a billion. Trillion was a word people used to mean incomprehensibly humongous. But this is the age of deconstruction, and everything has been multiplying until now there's too much of everything. Cars, people, atoms, galaxies, and money, and especially too much confusion. 1 trillion times too much. Consider the confusion emanating from the former Soviet Union. Almost all the new countries that have emerged from that empire have rejected the Russian ruble and are coming out with their own currencies. So we now have the Azerbaijani malat, the Kazakhstani tumen, the Slovenian tolar, the Bosnian dinar, the Ukrainian hryvnia, the Estonian kroon, the Latvian lat, and the Lithuanian lit. It sounds like all this new currency is issuing forth from the Babylonian Treasury Department located in the Tower of Babel. Anyway, a lit, a lat, a buck, or a pound, in the end, it's all just filthy lucre. Maybe when we Northern Californians finally wise up and decide to secede from the Union, we can have our own currency too, called the Cisco, now trading for 3 lits or 19 kroons. If Jesus were around today, he would have his hands full chasing all these money changers around, especially with all the new capitalist countries in the world. It's ironic that most capitalist nations also consider themselves Christian nations, since Jesus himself was a communalist, and today would probably call himself a socialist. Remember, Jesus told people to give up all their material possessions. He was a radical street preacher and hung out mostly with poor people. Some believe that Jesus did advocate paying your taxes, however, because he once said, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's." I think that's a misprint. He really just said, "Render Caesar." There are many reasons to celebrate Easter this April, fogheads. This is the first Easter since the Vatican officially absolved the Jews of killing Jesus. Jews are finally off the hook and can watch the Easter parade without feeling guilty. But if the Jews didn't kill Jesus, then it must have been orders from Rome that had him killed, which means, in short, the Italians did it. The Vatican has no comment on that theory. Personally, on Easter, I pray to the bunny rabbit. How did a bunny rabbit get into Easter anyway, you may wonder? There are no bunnies mentioned in the biblical story of the crucifixion or resurrection. Most likely, the bunny rabbit hopped into Easter from the old pagan festival of springtime. The bunny rabbit stands for sex and reproduction and for the juicy abundance of life that proliferates every springtime here on Earth. Perhaps the rabbits can be seen as a counterpoint to Jesus, who escapes his earthly resting place and rises up to heaven. The bunny rabbit is a symbol of Earth as a paradise, especially in springtime. Maybe if people learned how to love the Earth more, then we wouldn't long so much for some heaven up above. Finally, Fogheads, a lot of people are more excited about watching the Giants opener at Candlestick on Monday than they are about Easter services on Sunday. And when the Grateful Dead sing the national anthem at the Stick, they should do their own extended version, noodling around inside the song like Jimi Hendrix did, but maybe with a Grateful Dead twist, like sticking U.S. blues into the middle of it. So in this April of our lives, Fogheads, wave that flag, say a prayer for the bunny rabbit, and when you do your taxes, don't forget to claim yourself as a deduction. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you once again and always, Fogheads, if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, from Earth Days to the end of days, from crazy cults to queer nations, this is Scoop Nisker with another edition of the Weekly Scoop. The Branch Davidian disaster has been thoroughly ravaged by the necrophiliacs in the news media, and now it's my turn. I agree that David Koresh and his followers were crazy, but on the other hand, it's really not so hard these days to believe that the apocalypse is near. In fact, there were a number of high-ranking members of the Reagan administration who believed it. Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, once told reporters that we don't have long before the Messiah returns. Indeed, the Reagan administration was a dangerous cult that gained the status of a religion for a while in America, with a large congregation of citizens who believed in stockpiling weapons and in the doctrine of everybody for themselves, a sure prescription for disaster. And while we're on the subject of cults, what about the FBI? A self-contained bunch of heavily armed professional paranoids who believe they alone understand how the world works and who the enemy is. The CIA is of the same ilk, operating internationally, and maybe it's time these cults were surrounded and forced to come out with their hands up. Meanwhile, here's a statistic for you. Last year, post-Cold War, the budget for all of the so-called intelligence operations of the United States government was $79 million a day. Sad to say, President Clinton is not asking for any cuts at all in the CIA budget for next year. Maybe it's because the secret government is too powerful for any president to handle, at least until the rest of us get vocal and demand that these so-called intelligence organizations be cleaned up. Meanwhile, onward to Washington, D.C., Sunday, April 25th, for the largest civil rights march in our nation's history by an indigenous minority of American citizens, now known as Queer Nation. And how things have changed. I may have been one of the few in the media to cover the first Gay Freedom Day parade in San Francisco back in 1970, when only about 50 homosexuals, as they were known at the time, marched through downtown San Francisco demanding human rights and respect. Instead of chanting the anti-war slogan, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, NLF is gonna win," they chanted, "Ho, ho, homosexual, ruling class is ineffectual." There was not a single lesbian in that first little parade, and now nearly 1 million men and women are marching in Washington. At first, the issue was homosexual rights. A few years later, it was gay rights, then lesbian and gay rights. This year, it is lesbian, gay, and bi rights. Maybe the bis should get double rights. Of course, all Americans are entitled to fundamental freedoms, but more important, all forms of human love should be honored as sacred. Finally, Fogheads, this week the annual Earth Day was celebrated around the world, and we should all be proud of the fact that the Bay Area and Northern California are the home of the environmental movement. Here we have the deepest ecologists and the bravest eco-warriors, from David Brower in the early days of the Sierra Club, to Friends of the Earth and Earth Island Institute, to Randy Hayes and the Rainforest Action Network. This is the home of the philosophers of eco-spirituality, such as Gary Snyder and his Earth Household, and Ernest Callenbach and his Ecotopia, Joanna Macy and Starhawk and Peter Berg of the Planet Drum Foundation, and also the main gathering place of neo-pagans and Earth worshippers who have led the resistance from saving the whales to the anti-nuclear movement to Redwood Summer to Rainforest Action. Mother Earth salutes you all and thanks you once again with springtime. So Fogheads, love your mother, work for gun control and sanity, be queer or gay or even happy if you want, and if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, it all started 15 or 20 billion years ago, give or take a few million, when there was a really big bang, and out of that great cosmic orgasm came the cooked and cooling contents of the primal soup, spewing out into the space-time continuum where the subatomic particles evolved themselves into this solid liquid and gas of a universe that you are now experiencing, the current shape of things. And this is Scoop Nisker bringing you some more stories from the here and now on another edition of the Weekly Scoop. This week, the media has been reviewing Bill Clinton's first 100 days as president and giving him a poor grade. But perhaps we should evaluate Clinton's record in comparison to what George Bush might have done in his first 100 days if he had been elected to a second term. It is doubtful that George Bush would have been able to pass a job stimulus package either, because Bush wouldn't have even proposed a job stimulus package. Chances are Bush would still be denying there's an economic problem. Of course, President Bush might have long since decided to do something in Bosnia. It probably would have been called Balkan Storm, and thousands of innocent civilians might have died in high-tech bombing raids. If George Bush were president, gays in the military would not be an issue, period. If George Bush were president, the Biodiversity Treaty would still be unsigned by the United States. If Bush were president, the healthcare reform plan would not be ready yet either, or even in the works. Bill Clinton may not be doing as well as people had hoped, but before you label him a failure, just consider what the alternative could have been like. And besides, 100 days is really not enough time to assess anyone's job performance. Just ask yourself, what have you accomplished since the beginning of February? And what is 100 days when you consider the 15 billion year history of the universe? We Americans are very impatient, but we should give Clinton at least a few more days to create a new and improved planet. Meanwhile, Fogheads, the whole world of politics is looking very strange these days. We've got gays and lesbians demanding the right to join the military and kill for their country. We've got liberal members of Congress lobbying to keep big military bases open. And we've got old bleeding heart liberals and pacifists demanding U.S. military intervention in Bosnia. Before you know it, we'll see radicals calling for an increase in Star Wars funding. Finally, this week the government reported that the economy grew by only 1.8% last quarter, down from 4.7% the previous quarter. The media unanimously report this as bad news, but there are growing numbers of people who applaud an economic slowdown. They say we've got to learn how to live at current levels of production and consumption if we're going to save the biology of the planet, and that we've got to turn away from materialism as our salvation and start building a society based on some different values. Keeping the big picture in mind, perhaps Clinton shouldn't try to create another economic boom like the glut of the Reagan years, but only redistribute the existing wealth a little better. We should remember that our affluent society has not made us a particularly happy or contented people. Maybe we should try something different. A slogan of the 60s was, "Make love, not war." Maybe in the 90s it should be, "Make love, not money." The way things look now, we might as well accept our fate and turn it into an opportunity for positive change. And this is Scoop Nisker saying, enjoy this spectacular Northern California springtime, Fogheads, the best in many years. Stay high, but keep your priorities straight. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, the universe is thinning out, the old yin-yang is doing its thing, and the laws of karma are coming around to say hello on another edition of the Weekly Scoop. And I'm Scoop Nisker with the nitty and the gritty and the dirty lowdown. The motto of the Clinton campaign for president was, "It's the economy, stupid." The motto of the Clinton administration should be, "It's the stupid economy." But the fault, my fellow Americans, lies not with our president, but with our moment in history and our expectations. The stark truth is that nobody can bring back the great American economic dream and make everything okay again. The years of 6% growth rates are gone for now and perhaps for good. The empire is in the midst of its inevitable decline. If you were born any time since the end of World War II, you were probably brought up under the myth that the economy would expand forever and all future generations would be better off until that glorious day when everyone would have everything they wanted and live happily ever after. It was an immature fantasy and an impossible dream, and now we have to come back to reality. Taking an overview of the news of recent years, it becomes obvious that the American empire is in decline. We have the biggest debt of any nation in history, a huge trade deficit, our state and local governments are almost bankrupt, and our institutions and infrastructure are falling apart. As a political and economic superpower, it seems our glory days are over. I contend that this is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not the end of the world, and it's certainly nothing to be ashamed of. Our only embarrassment might be that we held the title for so short a time. But if you look back over history, you'll see that empires rise and fall at fairly regular intervals, and that no empire lasts forever. The once mighty Egyptian empire is now just a poor country called Egypt, with a few decaying pyramids and a sphinx without a nose to mark its former glory. The Aztec, Greek, Roman, Ottoman, French, Spanish, British, and Soviet empires have all followed the same pattern. Only a few decades ago, the Brits were proud to say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Today, Great Britain is just a few chilly little islands in the North Atlantic, and you might say the sun never even rises on the British Empire. After the Second World War, the United States took over many former European colonies in search of resources to fuel the American dream, and we soon established an economic empire that would eventually require political and military intervention to secure. Now that empire has come apart, and the United States no longer dominates the world economy. The Japanese make better cars and TV sets than we do, the Italians make better shoes, and the French still make better bottled water. The only things we continue to do better than anyone else, it seems, is litigation and entertainment. In our days of decline, there's really nothing to fear, fogheads, but fear itself. Remember, it's a long process, and that, for instance, Rome didn't decline in a day. During the collapse of the Roman Empire, many citizens probably didn't even know it was happening, and a few centuries later, they started calling themselves Italians, and they seem to be doing fine today. If decline is our fate, as it seems to be, perhaps the best thing we can do is embrace it and see it as an opportunity to change. In these difficult transitional days, we should remember that being a superpower and having great material wealth did not make us a particularly happy or peaceful nation. We might finally be learning the lessons we need in order to move on toward a sustainable economy and environment and a more peaceful and harmonious life. And when it comes to blame, I don't think we can put it on Clinton or even Reagan for that matter. Just blame it on history and the shifting fate of all nations. Then we can get on with the work of creating something new here in this still young and wonderful place called America. And for the Weekly Scoop, this is Scoop Nisker saying, have a nice decline, and if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, this is your raving reporter Scoop Nisker with another edition of the weekly Scoop Boop Be-Doop. This week, Clinton bashing became the national pastime, fueled by his visit to a Hollywood hairstylist. If Shakespeare was around, he would say, this was the unkindest cut of all. Meanwhile, a poll shows that Governor Pete Wilson has a terrible job approval rating, even lower than Jerry Brown's when the former governor was talking about lowered expectations. And nobody seems to have a good word to say about Mayor Frank Jordan. Of course, Jordan and Pete Wilson both register 0 on the charisma meter, and while Clinton is a likable guy, he doesn't seem capable of generating much public enthusiasm either. But the bottom line is, fogheads, all three of these guys got caught at the helm as their ships of state began hitting the dangerous reefs of reality, and it is doubtful that any skipper could now satisfy the passengers of this American luxury liner who were apparently told when they booked passage that they would have a smooth cruise all the way. And as usual, the poor are down below where they are the first to go. Meanwhile, this is Memorial Day weekend, fogheads, a time to remember those who died in war, and in their honor I would like to launch a new war, a war on guns. I know, a war on guns sounds like an oxymoron, but we are moronic oxen, especially if we don't take up this fight. As I see it, the human species is not quite evolved enough to stop having wars. Some wise guy, I think, once said, the war will always be with you. But if we can't eliminate war, we could still try to cut down on the available guns in the world, and then when people go to war, at least they won't hurt each other so much. Currently, the biggest supplier of guns to the world is the United States of America, which now accounts for 57% of all the weapons sold to third world countries. Of course, we have to keep that trade deficit down, and while the Japanese may produce better cars and TV sets, we still make some of the world's best darn guns right here in America. But if we want a relatively peaceful world in the next century, then President Clinton should start cutting back on U.S. arms sales abroad right now, even if it creates more problems for the ailing defense industry and the trade deficit. Which brings me around to the war on guns right here at home, fogheads, where you can buy a gun almost as easily as a juicer. Guns are now everywhere, and you can see the results every single day in the news. I contend that the proliferation of guns has now become a matter of national security, which therefore justifies the curtailment of individual freedoms when it comes to owning one. The current gun control debate in Congress is a joke, arguing over whether or not a citizen should have to wait 7 days before purchasing a firearm. All that would do is maybe ensure more convictions for premeditated murder. It's time to get serious, fogheads, and tell the National Rifle Association and the gun lobby that the right to bear arms has become unbearable. People should be able to shoot for sport if they want, but that should be strictly regulated, while the random sale of guns should be banned. There should also be a major national campaign to turn in all guns, pay people double or triple their value. It would save us all a lot of money and suffering in the long run. Of course, my war on guns will probably be shot down. People will say it's impractical and impossible and unconstitutional, and that the nation and the world are just not ready for the war on guns. But I thought I'd throw the idea out there anyway, in honor of Memorial Day and the ideal of a nonviolent society. To turn a phrase around, fogheads, these days, whenever I hear the word gun, I reach for my culture. And this is Scoop Nisker saying, put down that gun and put on your samba shoes and have a great carnival weekend and a memorable Memorial Day. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, this is Scoop Nisker, and today we're talking about the evolution as we take another roll on that old rock of ages on the Weekly Scoop. It's dinosaur time in America, fogheads. Over the past couple decades, there's been a growing interest in dinosaurs, and it will probably peak this summer after the release of Jurassic Park. The multi-million-dollar Spielberg movie monster has over 1,000 product tie-ins, including playing cards, mugs, backpacks, gummy dinosaurs, and Jurassic Park lip balm with a dinosaur top. There's also a McDonald's tie-in. Maybe they will even admit they use dinosaur parts in their hamburgers. In any case, fogheads, welcome to the Jurassic as it comes to visit us here in the Holocene, which is what our time in geographic history is called. We're living in Holocene Park. It seems that American kids got real interested in dinosaurs back in the early 1980s, just about the time that Ronald Reagan was elected president. Maybe there's a connection there, I don't know. But there is something a little odd and ominous about the current dinosaur mania. Why have humans suddenly become so interested in these beasts of extinction? Whatever the reason, it's probably good to know all about dinosaurs so we can recognize the ones we see around us every day. And there's a lot of them on the loose. For example, there's dinosaur helms and dinosaur dole, also known as the pterodactyl. Then there's the dinosaur of the healthcare system. I think it's called Hippocratosaurus. And just recently, somebody spotted the dinosaur of Reaganomics, also known as the trickle-down dactyl, which is still stomping around Washington, D.C., Sacramento, and City Hall, saying we've got to cut more government programs rather than raise taxes. Then there's the terrible pterodactyl, a dinosaur that eats way too much green stuff and grows by millions of pounds every day. Many people say that our federal, state, and local governments are all dinosaurs, subspecies of the clumsy Bureaucratosaurus. But here in America, the people are the government, so maybe we have met the dinosaurs and they are us. We can only hope that our species is as successful as the dinosaurs were. They survived for over 100 million years before they were accidentally wiped out. So far, we've survived for about 500,000 years, and there are serious questions about our future. Maybe our ratio of brain size to body size is not too useful. I'm not suggesting bigger bodies, fogheads, but maybe smaller brains would help. Meanwhile, I think environmentalists should develop a tie-in to Jurassic Park and adopt a dinosaur as their new mascot. Of course, it's too late to save them, and I don't think we want to clone them back into existence like they do in Jurassic Park, but we could use the dinosaurs as a teaching device. Instead of Smokey the Bear, I see a public service campaign using an animated character named Billy Brontosaurus saying, "Don't foul up your atmosphere, boys and girls, or you'll become extinct like me." The latest theory says that dinosaurs died out after a big meteor hit the Earth, blowing up enough dust and debris to create an atmospheric cloud that blocked out the sun. The dinosaurs' fate should thus also remind us that we don't have ultimate control over our destiny and that the universe can still have its way with us anytime it wishes. Finally, on the subject of dinosaurs, fogheads, there will be demonstrations at the Lawrence Livermore Labs this weekend with a nonviolent blockade of the plant called for Monday morning. It's a protest against ongoing nuclear weapons research at Livermore, which is now designing a new generation of small-sized nuclear bombs called micro-nukes. I guess they would be used in little micro-nuclear wars. Anyway, fogheads, remember what Billy Brontosaurus says, "You don't want to have a nuclear winter effect like we had, boys and girls, so crush those nukes out now." And this is Scoop Nisker saying, listen to Billy. Don't forget the Festival of the Lake this weekend in Oakland, the city that's learning how. And remember, If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, from outer space to in your face, from the Jurassic to the Holocene, it's time for another edition of the weekly Scoop Bop-a-loop-bop-a-lop-bam-boom. First of all, Fogheads, some science news. This week, astronomers said they have found a new class of stars that are very hot and bright because their outer layer of gases have burned away. Scientists are calling them naked blue stars, and I'll bet the prudes are already drafting an ordinance to keep naked blue stars from entering our galaxy. They will not even be allowed on the streets of Berkeley. Also from the cosmic plane this week, scientists say that by measuring the movements of other galaxies, they have found new evidence that our own galaxy is full of dark matter. Of course, they could have discovered that by just looking at Congress. Which brings me back to Earth and to the main topic for today. I may be foolish, I may be ridiculed for this, but I would like to now offer a modest and qualified defense of President Bill Clinton. Okay, I admit he's backed off some fights he should have fought, and he's having a very hard time learning how to play government with the big boys. But as I see it, Clinton's biggest problem is that he's struggling against 2 decades of encrusted right-wing politics in America. The reason there's so much confusion in Washington these days is because Clinton is trying to move the country back toward the middle, just a little bit. And the people who took power during the Bush and Reagan years don't want to give any of it away. For example, the big oil lobby defeated Clinton's plan for a BTU energy tax. Instead, they want a transportation tax, which means a tax at the pump, which puts more burden on the ordinary wage earner. Listening to the outcry, you would have thought Clinton was trying to nationalize the oil industry. But of course, Fogheads, you've known for a long time who owns America. President Clinton wants a jobs program, and he wants more spending on inner cities and a decent health care system, but the politicians in Washington are telling him you've got to cut even more government programs. They want him to cut programs so they won't have to raise taxes. That was a political no-no they learned during Reaganomics. Clinton is even trying to raise income taxes on the wealthiest Americans, God forbid, those who saw their tax rates cut in half during the Reagan years. But even that part of Clinton's plan is in trouble in the U.S. Senate, which is now trying to delay the tax hike on the wealthy. The Senate would rather raise revenue by cutting more billions of dollars from Medicaid and Medicare. So I guess we all know who owns the U.S. Senate. The reason Bill Clinton is in trouble is because he's trying to redistribute the wealth a little, Fogheads. Not a lot, mind you. He's not some crazy socialist or anything. He's just a moderate liberal trying to bring a little economic justice and compassion back into American life. That's why I'm trying to avoid cynicism and not giving up on the Clinton administration just yet. If you are tempted to, just think about how frightening the alternative could be, like President Bob Dole in 1996. And so, Fogheads, although we may turn out to be fools, I suggest we rally around Clinton's moderately liberal programs for a while yet. If we could do that, then just maybe, Clinton would find enough courage to stand up for them himself. Finally, I have a couple more suggestions for you, Mr. President. First of all, I still think you should appoint Anita Hill to the Supreme Court. She would make up for the Lonnie Grenier fiasco, and besides, just imagine her sitting there next to Clarence Thomas on the bench, making sure he keeps his hands on top of his robes. And lastly, Mr. President, please don't resume any nuclear testing after the ban expires at the end of this month. Even before any long-term agreement is signed, Mr. Clinton, you could send a message to the world that as far as the United States is concerned, the era of nuclear weapons madness is behind us. If you fail to do that, Mr. President, you will lose a major part of my sympathy and support. And this is Scoop Nisker signing off by saying, don't be a dinosaur and live in Jurassic Park, Fogheads. Follow me, enter the Holocene era, and keep hope alive. And remember also to stay high but keep your priorities straight. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own.
Okay, that's the end of this tape. I guess I'll get you a second tape. Anyway, yeah-ho.
Brother, but I am every mother's son, and I'm here to give you some lowdown and far out on another edition of the weekly Scoop-oopy-doop. So should we call the hot weather we've had this week a heat wave, or is it global warming? Have a nice day anyway, Fogheads. For me, I'm a foghead in more ways than one, and I'll take the cool gray fog any day. The fog keeps you awake and stimulated. Surfaces become softer. Things are more hidden and mysterious. I say the cool is way cool. And thankfully, the heat is always temporary in the Bay Area, because as soon as the Central Valley gets hot enough, then the difference in temperatures pulls the ocean breezes inland. So after a few days of heat, the Bay Area always cools off, thanks to the fact that Sacramento sucks. Which brings me around to the budget crisis. Senators use their budget axes, cut back spending, raise some taxes. Everything will be just fine if you pay your share and I keep mine. In the new state budget, Governor Wilson wants to do away with renter's credit, and I'm a renter and I say no, raise property taxes instead. And there's the problem, fogheads. Nobody wants to give an inch or a buck. So just try to budget. You can't budget. The budget is a bludgeon, an axe that wants to cut into all our desires. Maybe we should cut back our desires, and then we can balance the budget. Tell that to people whose needs and desires are one and the same. But look on the bright side, fogheads. Maybe if things get worse, the governments will go out of business altogether, which will mean the withering away of the state, and that is the goal of communists as well as conservative Republicans. You figure it out. If we can't make ends meet, then the ends will meet. I don't pretend to understand it, fogheads. My only suggestion is eat the rich. I can say that because I'm not one of them. And yes, remember what Mahatma Gandhi said, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for anyone's greed. Meanwhile, fogheads, welcome to Queer Nation, or at least to Queer City. For this weekend anyway, San Francisco belongs to gays and lesbians who are holding their annual big parade and party under the theme, The Year of the Queer. I was one of the few journalists on hand to cover what may have been the first Gay Freedom Day parade back in the spring of 1969. That year, about 50 gay men marched down the sidewalks of San Francisco's business district, chanting and carrying a banner demanding homosexual rights, a very outdated term. At the time, I thought the parade was just another bit of counterculture flamboyance, but it turned out to be much more than that. The parade was leading a revolution in species behavior as all of a sudden, on a mass scale, sexual identities began to be deconstructed and reconstructed in many new and unusual combinations. In that first parade, a group of campy baton twirlers led the procession, and a few drag queens walked along in the back, causing businessmen to stare in shock. There were no lesbians at all in that parade. But by the end of the 70s, every year, over 250,000... Fogheads, 'tis the rainy, refrainy, insane holiday season, and this is Scoop Nisker with a weekly scoop of fa-la-la-la-la and ho-ho-hum. Yes, it is that time of year, fogheads, even in Berkeley, where we try to make our holiday rituals both politically and spiritually correct. For example, the old Jewish celebration of Hanukkah is given new meaning in some Berkeley homes. Traditionally, Hanukkah commemorates a Jewish uprising in the 1st century BC against an Assyrian emperor who tried to force the Jews to worship Zeus and other Greek gods. Many New Age Jews wouldn't mind doing that, especially if Dionysus was included. But back in BC, the Jewish Maccabees refused, and in their temple they lit candles that burned miraculously for 8 days. At the Hanukkah celebration I attended in Berkeley, someone said we might consider the candles as a light against the empire of commerce, which these days wants us only to worship Mammon, the god of materialism. Somebody else said that the Hanukkah candles are a symbol of religious freedom in this nation of Christians. That prompted the kids to ask their traditional American Hanukkah question, why don't we get these 8 days off from school? Finally, someone reminded us that both Hanukkah and Christmas had their roots in pagan worship, and that lighting candles in the season of darkness is a way of honoring the sun and asking it to burn longer and stronger again. This kind of revisionist ritual also happens in Berkeley during Passover, when Moses sometimes gets turned into a feminist, and the Buddha is honored for leading people out of the bondage of their mind into the promised land of nirvana. Sure, these eclectic ceremonies sometimes sound a little corny or contrived, but the purpose of any ritual is to unite people in a community of shared belief. And as John Lennon might have said, whatever gets you through the long winter night, it's all right. While the Hanukkah candles were being lit, another kind of fire appeared in the news this week. It came from the U.S. Department of Energy, which is a euphemistic name for an agency that could have been called the Department of Entropy. The DOE was in charge of U.S. nuclear weapons testing throughout most of the Cold War, and newly declassified documents reveal that it conducted hundreds of secret underground nuclear tests, and that hundreds of American citizens were used as experimental subjects and exposed to plutonium without their knowledge or consent. It's estimated that the DOE produced 90 metric tons of weapon-grade plutonium over the years, a third more than was needed for the bombs being assembled. A lot of that material is now in temporary storage around the country, and some of it has begun to leak and spread radiation. And so far, nobody knows how to dispose of it or store it safely for the long, long term. And while we're on the subject of Cold War insanity, fogheads, the magazine New Scientist revealed this week that Star Wars was in the works as far back as the Eisenhower administration, when the Pentagon began making plans to install nuclear weapons on the moon. One general explained that if we had nukes on the moon, the Soviets would have to launch a strike against our moon missiles at least 2 days before they could attack the continental United States, or else we would be able to retaliate from the moon and destroy them as well. The Cold War was so insane, beyond all belief. And at least this holiday season we can be thankful that some of that madness is finally winding down. And this season we can also light a candle against the ignorance of the nuclear fires. And let's also offer up a little zany prayer to Zappa, who no longer has to contend with the slime oozing out of his TV set. And finally, don't forget to do your Santa mantra. Ho, 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 ahum. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you, Fogheads, if you don't like the seasonal rituals your ancestors gave you, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, the North American Free Trade Agreement looks like a done deal, and this is El Scupo, soon to be broadcasting from Guadalajara, where the transmitters are cheaper and there's no Federal Communications Commission forcing me to serve the public interest or use clean language. The sucking sound has begun, Fogheads, and this is Scoop Nisker with another edition of El Scupo Seminal. I'll explain my own plan to take advantage of NAFTA in a minute, but first, a few stories of interest in the news. You may have read this week about a Bay Area conceptual artist, a man named Nicolino, who is planning to hang a mile-long string of braziers across the Grand Canyon. In response, I think a woman artist ought to hang a string of jockstraps across 2 peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Of course, maybe I'm misinterpreting Nicolino's artistic statement. Sometimes a canyon is just a canyon. Also in the news this week, final confirmation of an old conspiracy theory. Declassified government documents reveal that in the early 1960s, the CIA was indeed working hand-in-hand with the Mafia to kill Fidel Castro. Their assassination schemes included exploding cigars, a paper-mate pen with a poisoned syringe attached, and a plan to spray an LSD-like chemical on Castro. They even had a chemical that would make Castro's beard fall off. The CIA never did like beards or leftist leaders like Castro. Instead, they supported people like Premier Key in Vietnam, Marcos in the Philippines, Pinochet in Chile, the Shah in Iran, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti. Now that the Cold War is over, isn't it time to decommission the CIA and start a new agency, one that believes in democracy and has a little central intelligence? And finally, Fogheads, back to the story of the week, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I must confess, Fogheads, that in return for not speaking out against NAFTA, the Clinton administration has promised me a frequency on the FM radio band in Guadalajara. And as soon as we pay off the right Mexican officials, I plan to start a classic rock station down there, KOLA, Keola. We'll play lots of Santana, Los Lobos, and of course put a few cuts of Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass in regular rotation. You'd be surprised how much cheaper it is to run a radio station in Mexico, and after NAFTA goes into effect, we can turn up the wattage and blast it right across the free trade border into the United States. Furthermore, there will soon be a lot more multinational corporations in Mexico willing to buy advertising on my station. We'll sell car phones and personal computers and designer jeans and gourmet dining experiences. Just think of the profits. Remember, there are millions of Mexican citizens who don't have any of that stuff yet. And that's not the only way I plan to take advantage of NAFTA. You may not know this, but one clause in the NAFTA treaty will ban the traditional Mexican siesta. No more naps during the day for Mexican workers. In anticipation of what will happen as a result, I'm planning to take the New Age movement south of the border. Maybe build some stress reduction clinics in Mexican cities. These clinics will teach yoga and also provide counseling to Mexican families on how to cope with their new stressful, high-tech, high-speed society. Yes, Fogheads, as a result of NAFTA, soon all of Mexico will start to look more like Los Angeles, and of course Los Angeles will start to look more like Mexico. The sucking sound will be heard on both sides of the border, because we are well on the way toward a one-world economy and a one-world culture too. And someday, every place you go will look like the place you came from. In the future, if you like to travel to exotic foreign lands, you'll have to rely on your virtual reality software. But remember, while you may lose your sense of place and ethnic identity, your credit cards will be accepted everywhere. With NAFTA, Fogheads, and GATT, we are truly on our way to a global village. And the only thing we have to lose are our villages. And this is El Scupo saying, watch out for exploding cigars, don't take any paper pesos, and remember, If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads! The sounds I am now making are being electronically formed into frequency-modulated airwaves or FM and transmitted to your radio, where they are electronically transformed into vibrations that resonate on your eardrum and are interpreted by your brain right back into the sounds I am making, which turns out to be another edition of the Weekly Scoop. And this is Scoop Nisker airwaving at you and reminding you that FM broadcasters do it with frequency. First, a note on evolution. A statistic from the Harper's Index says that on average, sexual intercourse for a chimpanzee lasts only 7 seconds, while the average time for a human is 2 minutes. Does this mean we are having more fun or just getting less efficient? It seems everybody these days is fixated on the Bobbitt case and the one man who had his penis cut off by a woman. Meanwhile, writer Alice Walker has been quietly publicizing the fact that millions of women around the world are genitally mutilated on a regular basis as part of cultural and religious traditions. Hopefully this practice will stop in the year 2000 when God finally reveals herself. There's a new book out, Fogheads, entitled How the White House Illegally Armed Iraq. It details how the Reagan and Bush administrations supplied weapons to Saddam Hussein in Iraq throughout the 1980s, shipping them from U.S. military bases in Europe without telling Congress. After the Gulf War, Bush allegedly tried to hide this information from Congress and the public. Meanwhile, recently released CIA and State Department documents reveal that Reagan and Bush were also hiding information from Congress that linked the right-wing military leaders of El Salvador with death squads and drug smuggling. By hiding this information, the Reagan-Bush regimes were able to send millions of dollars of U.S. military aid to these murderers in the name of keeping Central America free. Maybe at this point I should quote the title of Rush Limbaugh's new book, See, I Told You So. But I wouldn't be so smug. Finally, Fogheads, just in time for Veterans Day, a bill was introduced in Congress last week that would set up, get this, a code of conduct for U.S. arms dealers. Now there's a self-canceling phrase if I've ever heard one. This code of conduct would ban U.S. weapons sales to any nation that abuses human rights or attacks their neighbors. I guess that eliminates everyone but Switzerland as a potential customer. But how can we ever be sure who will end up using the guns we sell? In recent years, American soldiers have been shot at by American-made weapons in Panama, Iraq, Somalia, and Haiti. The legislation is a beginning, but just like the Brady Bill, it doesn't go nearly far enough. When it comes to the Brady Bill or the Code of Conduct for arms dealers, I think we should require a 1,000-year waiting period before anyone can either buy or sell a gun. Maybe that would give the entire species time to evolve out of its murderous insanity. On this Veterans Day weekend, Fogheads, consider the fact that gunpowder was invented by the Chinese in the year 1000 AD, and that no other human invention has been so refined and perfected. As Albert Einstein once said, technological progress is like an axe in the hands of a pathological criminal. In the 20th century alone, an estimated 100 million people have been killed in war. Wouldn't it be great if by the year 2000 we could honor all the veterans of this century and all the victims as well with a sane policy on weapons both at home and abroad? We don't make them anymore, and we don't sell them anymore. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you to stay high but keep your priorities straight, and if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, what a fine season we are having. The temperature is temperate, the lighting is wonderful. It's the Bay Area's indigenous people's summer, also known as the fall. And if the fall is here, then the decline must have already happened, so there's nothing to worry about. And this is Scoop Nisker with a relatively upbeat edition of the Weekly Scoop. Looking at the news this week made me thankful once again that Bill Clinton is our president. The administration called for an international ban on dumping low-level nuclear wastes into the ocean, a reversal of U.S. policy under Reagan and Bush. Clinton's decision was prompted by the good work of the Greenpeace organization, which caught the Russians dumping liquid nuclear wastes into the Sea of Japan. Sushi, anyone? How about some raw tuna tumors or roe that glow? Greenpeace applauded the Clinton decision as a major victory for global environmental safety. Meanwhile, Fogheads, let's put some pressure on the Clinton administration to lift the U.S. economic embargo against Cuba. It's an outdated Cold War strangulation of our island neighbor, and this week the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to end the embargo. The only votes to continue were cast by the United States, Albania, Paraguay, and Israel. But I'm most sorry to report, Fogheads, that this week Congress killed the superconducting super collider. Now we may have to wait another century before we find the missing quark, or the force field that would pull all the subatomic mysteries together and finally give us the long-awaited theory of everything. Now, I'm no physicist, but I have a feeling that the theory of everything will turn out to be that everything is everything. No matter what you do to the equation, everything will always equal everything, and vice versa. So give me the Nobel Prize in Physics. Of course, if everything is everything, then I already have it. An ironic story from the Inferno. The first person to die in the Los Angeles fires this week was filmmaker Duncan Gibbons, whose 3 major movie credits are entitled Fire with Fire, The Eve of Destruction, and Third Degree Burns. Finally, Fogheads, this weekend the 4th annual San Francisco Book Festival will be held at the Concourse Exhibition Center, 10 to 6 on Saturday and Sunday. It's the largest book event on the West Coast and absolutely free to anyone who still can read or would like to learn. Books are the original interactive medium and furthermore can take you into virtual realities that broadcast technology has not yet dreamed of. I was recently in one of my favorite bookstores, Shambhala on Telegraph Avenue, which specializes in wild, mystical titles about Zen and consciousness and witchcraft and cosmic conspiracies. While I was there, 2 books caught my eye. One is entitled Earth, the Disneyland of the Gods. And another one, which I bought right away, is called The Yin-Yang Butterfly, Ancient Chinese Sexual Secrets for Western Lovers. In this book, I'm discovering new lovemaking positions with names like mounting tortoises and wrestling apes, along with descriptions of jade stalks being placed into cinnabar grottos. One technique called somersaulting dragons sounds like a lot of good fun, and furthermore is supposed to banish 100 illnesses. One technique that I will leave to your imagination is called the bunny licking its fur. Anyway, Fogheads, I suggest you get in between the covers of a good book. It may open up a whole new world of cinnabar grottos. And this is Scoop Nisker saying, stay high, but keep your priorities straight, Fogheads. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, take off your mask, look in the mirror, and scare yourself half to death. The other half of your death is waiting right here in the news. And this is Spook Nisker with the Halloween edition of the Weekly Spook. We begin our horror stories today with fire and brimstone and the frightening possibility that Los Angeles could burn to the ground. The only thing scarier is if Los Angeles doesn't burn to the ground. In other burning news, this year scientists say the ozone layer over Antarctica is very thin, Fogheads. So go ahead, just let yourself imagine what it would be like to live inside a microwave oven. Hot molecules, Fogheads, Patty Melt, and Johnny Melt too. And we have news from the dark, untamed world of nature, red in tooth and claw. The Interior Department has begun taking a survey of all the plant and animal life in the United States, and they are likely to make some grisly discoveries, like the fact that there aren't enough whooping cranes left to make whoopee, or that the snakes are disappearing. If you think snakes are scary, just imagine a world without snakes and the subsequent plague of frogs and rats. And for just plain disgusting, nauseating news for Halloween, Fogheads, the fact that Paramount Communications is going to start a 5th national television network. Yuck! More and more toxic junk to rot away the hearts and minds of America. It's the slime oozing out from your TV set. But what could be more scary than Election Day, Fogheads? It's no accident that they schedule it right after Halloween. They want voters to already be in fear when they enter the voting booth. And this year's ballot monster is Prop 174, the school voucher initiative, which would take tax money away from the public schools and give it to any group that can find 25 students to start up a private school. That means your tax money could go to fund the neo-pagan high school and their football team, the Warlocks, or even to support the Rush Limbaugh Elementary School, where children learn reading and right-wing arithmetic. Yes, on Halloween, beware of all propositions. And from the tortured hell realms of international politics, Fogheads, this week Secretary of State Warren Christopher tried to bribe the government of Kazakhstan into signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Scare yourself with the thought that Kazakhstan has over 1,000 nuclear warheads and long-range missiles. and that the third largest nuclear power in the world today is the Ukraine. And it's bound to happen someday. A crazed Kazakhstani or Azerbaijani or Ukrainian dictator, you know they're not as civilized as our leaders. One of them will stand up and say, "Give me the world or I'll blow it all up." And you thought the threat of nuclear war was over, didn't you? It's also spooky days in space, Fogheads. Astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia reported this week that their heads were swelling up and their legs were shrinking. Yes, that's due to a weightless environment. And since our society is getting more weightless by the minute, we may soon have a nation full of people with even bigger heads than they have now. Creepy. Well, before I go off to drink some blood, Fogheads, a couple of tips. You should check out the Day of the Dead procession in the Mission District on Tuesday night. Also this weekend, the 11th annual San Francisco Jazz Festival begins with 2 weeks of some of the finest music on the planet. Check papers for listings. And finally, Fogheads, on this Halloween weekend, we advise that you face the monsters of fear that lie within. Let what lurks in the shadows emerge because it may have something to teach you. Remember, the shadow knows. And finally, keep death over your left shoulder. Or is it your right shoulder? Oh well, it will get you in the end either way. And this is Spook Nisker saying, if you don't like the scary news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, this is Scoop Nisker, and today we go eco-tripping through the late days of the millennium, looking at life in the food chain and who's eating whom on another edition of the Weekly Scoop. Starting in space, last week a congressional committee voted to kill funding for NASA's radio telescope search for intelligent life in the universe. Too bad. If we found intelligent life on another planet, it might bring us together, help us see all humans as homies. It could also diminish our collective ego by refuting the idea that the whole universe was made just for us. On the other hand, if NASA didn't find intelligent life on other planets, it would make our own intelligence, as far as it goes, seem that much more precious and miraculous. Either way, the NASA search could benefit our souls and our psyches, but Congress killed the search because it wasn't cost-effective. News that should have made banner headlines this week was barely visible on the 10th page of our local newspaper. British scientists announced that the protective ozone layer above Antarctica is only 1/3 of its normal level this year, the thinnest ozone layer on record. Scientists expect the shield will return to normal sometime in the next century, but only if we humans can curtail our gas. Methane, which is a major cause of ozone depletion, comes primarily from cow farts. If we didn't eat so many cows, it would probably improve our digestion and that of the cows as well. Meanwhile, the ozone is still thinning, and for the time being, we should probably ship a load of sunglasses down to the polar bears. Which brings us to the endangered species list, Fogheads. I've been meaning to read to you from the list for a while now, and this week is appropriate because Congress is debating the Headwater Forest Act. This bill would protect a 3,000-acre stand of ancient redwoods in Humboldt County, our own backyard. Singer Bonnie Raitt testified in Washington this week that she often goes to those redwoods for spiritual and creative inspiration, and she cries to think that these magnificent 2,000-year-old beings would be cut down. And it's not only the redwoods that are in danger, so is the habitat of the marbled murrelet. Most of us have never met a marbled murrelet, and you might wonder what's the big deal. But if we don't protect the marbled murrelet and the spotted owl, then no species is sacred, and where do we stop? I refer to the endangered species list, which reads like a who's who of the animal world. All of our favorites from the TV nature shows are listed: the lions, tigers, elephants, and bears, the gorilla, jaguar, leopard, rhinoceros, and 13 species of monkeys. All the animals of our fairy tales and mythologies are facing extinction. 12 species of deer, 8 species of whales, 7 of otters, 5 of wolf, 12 of parrot, 8 of crane, 9 of parakeet, 5 of duck. All the creatures of our dreams and poetry, the giant sable antelope, the giant armadillo, the Mongolian beaver, the Mexican bobcat, the American alligator, the Jamaican boa constrictor, the San Francisco garter snake, 11 species of crocodile, 15 species of turtle, and the thin-spined porcupine. The endangered species list goes on with separate categories for birds, fishes and reptiles, and plants. The list should be posted in public places, read aloud in churches and schools, updated regularly in newspapers. Maybe every time a particular species makes the list, its picture could be put on milk cartons like a missing child. Otherwise, how else will we know? Of course, humans haven't put themselves on the list yet. probably because we think that a species is only endangered when there are too few of its kind. Couldn't a species also be endangered if there are too many of its kind? Maybe we've been so fixated on rearranging the planet for our needs that we haven't yet realized that those needs include wilderness and wildness and the whole web of life. For a copy of the endangered species list, you can write to the Department of the Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service. Pass it around. You can also call your representatives in Washington and lobby for passage of the Headwater Forest Act. By the way, this weekend at the Roxy Theater in San Francisco, you can see the premiere of a movie called Saviors of the Forest, which was described as the Roger and Me of the forest issue. And next time you see a redwood, fogheads, go ahead and let your urban cynicism go for a minute and give it a big hug. Finally, maybe everyone could choose one endangered species and devote their energy to saving it, and collectively we would imitate Noah and build ourselves a new ark. And this is Scoop Nisker saying, stand up for the right to arm bears, and if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, it's time for another episode of the Weekly Scoop. This week featuring appearances by Vladimir Lenin, Groucho Marx, Mohammed Aidid, Michael Jordan, Boris Yeltsin, and a cast of billions of extras, all strutting their brief hours upon the stage of history, a not-so-melodrama in too many acts. We begin our show in Moscow, where this week Boris Yeltsin came out on top of the Russian power struggle. Soon you can expect him to reinstate the monarchy and name himself Tsar. The United States would probably support that move as long as Tsar Boris promises to privatize everything, mortgage Mother Russia to the World Bank, and drop the price of Stoli. Meanwhile, Lenin is turning over in his grave again. He's been turning over so much in recent years that Yeltsin has apparently decided to move him out of his mausoleum in Red Square and bury him someplace less conspicuous. The fact is, every time Yeltsin and his supporters pass by Lenin's tomb, they feel a twang of guilt and even a little nostalgia for the revolution that lost its way. Speaking of lost revolutions, China conducted an underground nuclear test this week, defying the international moratorium. It's not surprising. The Chinese have always been fascinated with firecrackers. In fact, the Chinese invented gunpowder in the year 1000 AD, and now they are exploding atomic bombs, millions of times more powerful than cherry bombs. What an amazing advance in technology. Indeed, humans have made more progress inventing new ways to kill each other than in any other field of endeavor. Wouldn't it be nice on the millennial anniversary of gunpowder to celebrate a worldwide nuclear weapons ban, or go one step further and stop the proliferation of all types of guns and bombs across the planet? As the major supplier, Uncle Sam should lead the way into 1,000 years of peace on Earth. While we're on the subject of war and peace, some people are comparing U.S. involvement in Somalia with Vietnam. The analogy doesn't work. Somalia is no Vietnam, and Mohammed Aidid is no Ho Chi Minh. Don't expect to see young American protesters in the streets chanting, Aidid, Aidid, all Somalia must be freed. America was supposedly fighting communism in Vietnam, but in Somalia we're just trying to be helpful. Maybe we got started off on the wrong foot. That big amphibious military landing wasn't a great way to say hello, and our current troubles may prove that you can't help anybody if you go in with your guns drawn. The situation in Somalia calls out for the creation of a strong new UN peacekeeping force based on Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha. An army of people willing to die may be the only way to stop the killing around the world. And in religious news, this week Pope John Paul II issued a new Vatican encyclical entitled Veritatis Splendor, which is Latin for Splendor of the Truth. The encyclical states that there is only one moral code based on scripture and so-called natural law, and this moral code does not permit abortion, divorce, contraception, premarital sex, or homosexuality. The encyclical even states that contraception is intrinsically evil. I don't quite understand the theology behind this belief. Does the Pope think life begins at the moment of ejaculation? Could it be that God made sex pleasurable just in order to vex us and test us so that we would either learn self-control or else breed ourselves into oblivion? That seems like cruel and unusual punishment, especially from a God who we call our Father. Maybe Jehovah and his children are one big dysfunctional family. God loves you, and that's why he's making it hard for you, so to speak. Anyway, Fogheads, as Paul Krasner once said, Pope John Paul might be more popular if he called himself Pope John Paul, George, and Ringo. Veritatis Splendor, Goo Goo Gajoob. And speaking of Paul Krasner, the co-founder of the Yippies and editor of the infamous Realist magazine, Simon & Schuster has just published his autobiography. It's a hilarious life story entitled Confessions of a Raving Unconfined Nut, which is what the FBI called Krasner in their files. Among other wonderful tales in the book, Krasner tells about the time he took LSD with Groucho Marx. Say the secret word and a duck will drop down from the sky. Finally, tennis shoes off to Michael Jordan, who knew when to slam dunk a great career, and hallelujahs to Toni Morrison for the Nobel Prize in Literature, and kudos to all of yous just for being who you are in this glorious human procession. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you to stay high but keep your priorities straight, and if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, place your hands on your radio and say Om, or say what? And then fine-tune your ear to the sound waves vibrating with meaningful messages from another edition of the Weekly Scoop. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you that FM radio commentators do it with frequency. Modulate those airwaves, man, modulate. In Washington, D.C. this week, the Clinton administration announced it's going into business with the big three automakers to produce cars that get 80 miles to a gallon. President Clinton said the project is equivalent to putting a man on the moon and will usher in, quote, a new car-crazy chapter in American history, end quote. Like crazy, man, can you dig it? America is going to just keep cruising right on through the next century, or until the last drop of oil gets burned up and the last piece of earth gets paved over, or until we finally asphyxiate ourselves. And that may be the ultimate in fuel efficiency. After the president's announcement, scientists at Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos Nuclear Weapons Labs said they're converting advanced weapons technology to help build these cars of the future. The Defense Department is switching from Star Wars to Car Wars. And our new enemy is our old enemy, the Axis powers. That's right, we're in a race against Japan and Germany for the supremacy of the freeways. So in the year 2000, you could be driving the new Ford SDI, which will not only get great gas mileage, but will carry heat-seeking missiles to blow away any Honda it picks up on its radar. The new Chevrolet Stealth will be so lightweight you won't even see it, right up until its lasers blast another gas-guzzling BMW into crowd heaven. Anyway, fogheads, the Clinton administration has made its priorities known. Forget about new mass transit systems and light rail trains. We're Americans and individualists, and we will forever live and die for our right to own our own beep beep, yeah, car. But while we're on the subject of national defense, now that Hillary Clinton has gotten in shape wrestling with the medical industry, the president should send her out to do battle with the Pentagon. I think she's ready to go into the trenches with the cold warriors and defense industry captains, and no area of American government needs more reform than the Pentagon. Since the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States now spends more on its military than the next 10 nations combined. Our military budget is over 5 times higher than the next largest in the world. The latest Pentagon plan has us spending $1.3 trillion on defense over the next 5 years. That's $500,000 a minute. And for what? To threaten the Serbs? To hunt for Mohammed Aidid? The defense experts say we've got to be able to fight 2 wars at once, a win-win strategy. Meanwhile, funding for everything else continues to lose-lose. Furthermore, government audits continue to show the defense establishment riddled with fraud and waste. It's past time for major cuts and conversions and reform. I say, send in Hillary, the first woman first lady, the first person singular, Hillary against the Pentagon brass. And if she wins, Hillary for president in '96. Her husband will make a fine first gentleman. While we're on the subject of military conversion, fogheads, instead of making the lives of Bay Area homeless people even more miserable, why don't we take a little corner of the Presidio or Treasure Island or Alameda and open up a temporary community for homeless people with counseling and job training services available? It could be like a little Hooverville for the 1990s, but run by a coalition of Bay Area governments. We could call it a Reaganville, and in the end it would be cheaper than using police to chase the homeless from park to park and city to city, and furthermore, it would be the compassionate thing to do. By the way, maybe the real reason Mayor Jordan wants to take away the homeless people's shopping carts is because Peter McGowan wants them back. Safeway is running low. And finally, fogheads, as the Earth spins us through the fine burnished light of October suns and harvest moons, don't forget to give thanks for the privilege of being alive as giants or ordinary people in this best of all possible worlds, the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is Scoop Nisker saying, stay high, but keep your priorities straight. And if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads, let your mind expand into cosmic consciousness and prepare to receive the final news, the ultimate information, on another edition of the Weekly Scoop, where today we make everything perfectly clear. What concerns me most in the news this week is the dark matter. The dark matter I'm referring to is not the murky politics of the Soviet Union or the opaque Clinton healthcare reform package or even the ominous shadows of NAFTA. The dark matter I'm talking about is earth-shaking and paradigm-rattling, and it makes all these other little dark matters look like tiny punctuation marks on a single page of the great book of the history of the universe. The dark matter I'm talking about is dark matter. This week, scientists at UC Berkeley and Lawrence Livermore announced the discovery of a brown dwarf in the Milky Way galaxy. They really didn't see this brown dwarf, but they saw its gravitational pull on light from a star in another galaxy. This brown dwarf is sucking rays big time. Finding the brown dwarf could be one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century because it may confirm the existence of dark matter. And that could tell us the fate of the entire universe. Not the Russian Parliament or North American free trade, but the fate of everybody and everything. By the 1970s, scientists agreed that the explosion of the Big Bang had sent all matter, energy, and space-time expanding outward. And if this process continued, then the universe would eventually thin out into nothingness, a fate the scientists call cold death. However, if there's enough matter in the universe, then there would be enough gravity to slow the expansion down, and eventually the universe would begin contracting and finally collapse back into a single particle, just like the one that existed right before the Big Bang. Scientists call that a heat death. The process of contraction itself is called the Big Crunch, as opposed to the Big Bang. The Big Crunch sounds like a good name for a candy bar, perhaps a densely packed nougat of black hole-covered chocolate. And in the end, we will either have a big crunch or nothingness. Heat death or cold death. It seems the universe will get us coming or going. The scientists themselves have gone back and forth, so to speak, on what our fate will be. But now the discovery of dark matter means there may be enough gravity in the universe to slow down the expansion and start the big crunch. By the way, the reason they call it dark matter is because nobody can see it. Now, I'm sure the universe pays very little attention to my desires, but I like the big crunch idea because it would mean that we would all be pulled back together again and then maybe reborn out of another Big Bang into another universe. In fact, it's quite possible that universes just keep being born and dying, expanding and contracting over and over again, maybe until we all get it right. When the Dalai Lama was asked whether Tibetan Buddhists have a Big Bang in their cosmology, he replied, "Oh yes, but it's bang, bang, bang. There are many Big Bangs and many universes." So maybe after the Big Crunch is finished, there will be another Big Bang, and in the universe to come, everything will make more sense, and the various forms that consciousness takes will join together in a harmonious dance of joy. In the next Big Bang, the Russians won't have such a hard time with their governments, and there will be free and equitable trade throughout the cosmos, and everyone will have bodies of light, so there won't be any need for health care. And that, Fogheads, is why I think the discovery of dark matter is the most important story in the news this week, in spite of what other commentators may have you believe. Besides, as I always tell my journalist friends, you are what you cover, and big scientific perspectives give us all a little distance from the ongoing human dilemmas and disasters, a little respite. I see the astrophysicists' understanding of the universe as a cosmic disclaimer to the news. And so, now that we've shed some light on the dark matter, let me remind you to celebrate the expanding and contracting mystery this weekend at the KFOG-sponsored Blues Festival. And finally, this is Scoop Nisker reminding you to stay high but keep your priorities straight. And if you don't like the news of the universe, well, relax and let it happen. Fogheads, this is Scoop Nisker with a traditional Thanksgiving weekly scoop of leftover mashed potatoes. The gravy's on you. And since it is Thanksgiving weekend, Fogheads, it's time to call to order my annual protest group, the Bay Area Heathens Unified Movement to Boycott Yuletide Grossness, or Bah Humbug. To join our group, all you have to do is agree not to wish anybody a Merry Christmas until after the 13th of December, giving you at least the traditional 12 days. And furthermore, if given a Christmas greeting before December 13th, you agree to reply with the cry of Bah Humbug, which once again stands for the Bay Area Heathens Unified Movement to Boycott Yuletide Grossness. Now back to Thanksgiving, that wonderful holiday of gluttony reserved for Americans only. And I must say, I came to the table, I overate, and I gave thanks. Instinctively, I gave thanks for being alive, but then I remembered that we really don't have anything to compare it with. Maybe non-existence is better, and in fact, many great sages will tell you that the big cosmic void is the best place to hang out, especially during a recession. One thing I gave thanks for this Thanksgiving was health. It's the bottom line blessing, and comfort too. Just for a second, Fogheads, check in with your body. If it feels relatively healthy and comfortable, then you should give your body a big thank you. Go ahead and touch yourself. It's okay. Also this Thanksgiving, for the second year in a row, I gave thanks that George Bush is not President of the United States. What a blessing that is. And when it comes down to it, the traditional reason for giving thanks is usually good enough for me. Like the Pilgrims, I always give thanks for the abundance of this great continent, Turtle Island. And especially big thanks for living in the San Francisco Bay Area, my bioregion, my hometown. Just think of all the terrible places that circumstances might have forced you to call home, the lowlands of Bangladesh or the deserts of Somalia or even Dallas or Cincinnati for that matter. But instead, here we are in one of the finest natural habitats that humans can find, with temperate temperatures and cool ocean breezes to regularly clean your aura and keep you awake. And geographically, we have the Great Bay meeting the Pacific Ocean on the west, the richest farmland in the world lying a short distance to the east, and to the north, the fabulous golden hills reminiscent of Italy, growing grapes and olives and nuts, and all of that backed up in the barely visible east by some of the most powerful granite mountains in all the world. And in spite of the recession and the fact that this area is not quite what it was in this or that good old days, for many of us, San Francisco is still the Holy Land. Jerusalem and Babylon rolled into one, the birthplace of the new paradigm and headquarters of a late 20th century pagan revival. Ours is the last urban outpost of the Wild West, situated far from the authority centers of New York and Washington, D.C. Here we live half in the Orient, half in Central America, and half in the United States. And just beneath the surface of this serious Pacific Rim financial center and all-American city lives a vital core of otherness. An ever-evolving anarchist convention and costume party filled with jesters and fools and misplaced out-of-time geniuses, each with their own unique mix of sexual, political, and spiritual identities. The rebel force is still alive here in San Francisco, always called a backwater by the East Coast snobs and LA's slicks. But maybe ours is the spawning ground for the next civilization, and at the very least, it is the site of one of the last best parties of the declining empire and soon-to-be previous millennium. And for being here on Thanksgiving, I said thank you, Brahma, and thank you, Rama, and thank you to Mama Nanda and Papa Nanda and Allah and Jehovah, Isis and Dionysus, Mother Mary, Gaia, Coyote, and Zeus. And thanks to the great Tao, the unnameable cosmic oneness that contains and manifests all things. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you, if you don't like the fruitcake your aunt sends you around this time of year, go out and make some of your own. Fogheads from downtown San Francisco, Bay Area, Northern California, Sierra Watershed, North American continent, Northern Hemisphere, Western world, planet Earth, solar system, Milky Way, and the known universe. Here's the latest roll on the old Rock of Ages on another edition of the Weekly Scoop. First of all, a very happy New Year to Jewish people everywhere. The year is off to a great start with the peace agreement between Israel and the PLO. If Jehovah will excuse me for a moment, I have to take my yarmulke off to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He finally backed off from that hardline Israeli stance for the sake of peace and even a little justice for the Palestinians. As for Yasser Arafat, at least he could have shaved for the big signing in Washington. He's obviously trying to preserve his rugged image after selling out. Anyway, mazel tov to all involved and Om Shalom. This peace agreement will make it much easier to be both Jewish and liberal. By the way, did you notice U.S. government officials from Henry Kissinger to James Baker trying to take some credit for the Mideast agreement? Just remember, Fogheads, over the last 40 years, the United States has sold more weapons in the Middle East than anybody else. Billions of dollars worth to both Israel and Arab nations, and those sales are continuing today. If the Clinton administration really wants to contribute to further peace in the Middle East, it will stop preparing the region for war. Meanwhile, Fogheads, the great Taoist sage Lao Tzu says, "Those who know don't speak, and those who speak don't know." Maybe Lao Tzu was referring to NAFTA, or the new Clinton healthcare reform package. Nobody seems to know exactly what these plans will mean. Neither do I, but I'll explain them to you anyway. The Clinton healthcare reform plan leaked out of the White House this week. Maybe it needs a new catheter. To understand how this plan will work, you need a doctor and a doctorate, but it doesn't smell too good to me. The basic idea is that people will join together through work or other organizations to buy group health care from large insurance companies. Since these companies will compete with each other, healthcare prices are expected to go down. That's what they mean by managed competition. Unfortunately, the quality of healthcare is also likely to go down, and that's what they mean by managed care. Remember, health is wealth, and the medical industry takes that slogan literally. When your doctor examines your throat with a used tongue depressor, your tongue won't be the only thing depressed. It's obvious the Clinton administration had to compromise with the big insurance, medical, and drug company lobbies, and maybe this was the best plan they could get for now. At least all citizens will finally have some kind of health coverage, and in the end, the plan will probably encourage people to stay healthy. Meanwhile, when it comes to the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, you've got questions, nobody's got answers. Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan are both in favor of NAFTA, so it must be a bad idea. And George Bush is in favor of NAFTA, probably because one of his sons has a lot to gain from it. On the other hand, Jimmy Carter is also backing NAFTA, and Secretary of Interior Bruce Babbitt, an environmentalist of great integrity. So maybe it will be okay. The truth is, nobody knows what will happen if NAFTA is passed. But in general, I don't think the trend toward a one-world economy is healthy for the species. NAFTA will definitely contribute to further incorporating and conglomerating and mauling of the world. It will make it easier for 7-Elevens and Kmarts to move into Mexico, forcing out small, locally run stores. It will increase monocultural sameness until all of North America begins to look like a street in Los Angeles. NAFTA will benefit multinational corporations, which will grow even bigger as they export their products and advertising, pumping up desire for wealth and possessions, fueling individualism and competition. Maybe I'm just a sentimentalist, bogheads, trying to preserve a world that's already gone. Maybe the future will take shape and be just fine, and it won't have anything to do with my vision of how things should evolve. Meanwhile, I'm saying no to NAFTA just because it doesn't smell good to me. And for now, about all anyone can go on is their nose for news. And this is Scoop Nisker reminding you to keep the faith, baby, and Giants fans too, and make sure you celebrate this weekend for some reason or another. Have a sexy solstice, and as always, if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own.